Studying the short story, reading and analyzing fiction. Please note before you begin this slideshow, my goal is not to help you become a literary critic, but a better reader and writer. While there are not many terms and they're pretty basic, you will apply these constantly throughout the semester. You'll need not only to skim this information, but you really need to master it. If you need to, study this in chunks, either stopping the slideshow or pausing the video, and come back to it. You also should refer back to the PDF copy as you work through the quizzes on the stories themselves. If you read the course description, you'll see that our charge in this course is to learn how to respond to texts, as well as to include research from secondary sources. One important distinction for you to note: while we'll be reading stories and a few poems later, we will be writing essays in this course. So what you're reading and what you're writing are really different genres. It might be important here to note briefly what that difference is. The major difference is that these two genres have different purposes. What do you think the purpose of a short story or a novel or a film is? If you said to entertain, as many students do, have you ever thought about what that word really means? What does it mean to entertain? To amuse? To create enjoyment? As a verb, it can mean to consider, as in to entertain an idea. And certainly many stories are amusing. But I'd like you to entertain the idea that there's a greater difference between essays and poems, stories, plays, songs, and other fictive genres. What does an essay, whether it's narrative, expository, or argumentative, have to have? If you said a thesis, thank a prior teacher, because that's exactly right. Now, what's the corollary of thesis for a novel or a short story? What does a novel or a short story, in other words, have that's like a thesis? Did any of you think of the word theme? Well, give yourself a pat, because that's it. But I have another question. Think of the best novels, stories, movies, poems, or songs you've read, seen, or heard. Now, did you really go to the last movie you saw or read a novel because of its great theme? Did you think, I really have to go see the newest Batman because I want to form my opinion about good and evil and vigilantes, and that's my favorite theme? No. Then why? Well, you might circle back to this. You went to be entertained. And I will circle back to the same question. What about it was entertaining? It was entertaining because instead of reading an argument or searching for information, which can be kind of entertaining too, by the way, you were presented with an experience. The difference between the genres, then, is that the ones we categorize as creative, as if most human endeavors weren't, give us a vicarious experience. Now, this doesn't mean that the deep themes don't intrigue us or that they're not important, but they're secondary to the experience itself. So-called creative genres, then, including stories, are experiential media. We'll need to learn some terms and concepts to understand and write thoughtfully about the works we're studying this term. Learning to apply these terms will also supply you with a specific language to use in your essays this semester. In terms of your general education, reading and writing about literature, in this case short fiction and again a few poems, will help you to develop not only your writing skills, but to analyze, synthesize, make inferences, and draw conclusions, the skills that are important to critical thinking. Of course, you're already familiar with most of them. You had them in high school, but I do hope I will be able to deepen your understanding at least a little. The first term is setting. All stories, as you know, take place within a specific time and at a certain place. When you're reading, setting has three elements that you're going to need to consider. Number 1, the temporal or time frame, which includes a time of day, season, a period in history, a special time in a character's life. It all depends on the story. 2, the physical location, which might be as claustrophobic as an elevator or as open as a boat set adrift on the infinite sea. The larger community or cultural context is the third one, which involves clues about the wealth or poverty of the characters or the culture and values they share. In 12 Angry Men, one playwright makes good use of a stifling jury room before air conditioning, as jurors try to reach and cannot reach consensus because of one holdout. And of course, you can imagine that as the day wears on and they become tireder and the room gets hotter, their anger increases. Plot is the second term we'll look at. All of you know that plot is the action. The plot is what happens in the story. But it's so much more when we really come to study and analyze a short story. First, is the action mostly external or internal? How is the action revealed? How are the major sections of the story divided? Can the story be divided into the traditional parts of exposition, rising action, falling action, and resolution? When you reread the story, is the behavior of the characters or the conclusion of the story foreshadowed? In a story that has a surprise ending, if it's a really good story, you'll find when you go back and look at it and look at all the details and examine what happened, that it was really inevitable all along that this would happen. We just didn't know it necessarily at the time. The best definition of plot I know is this. A plot is a causally related series of events. Ian Forster, the great British novelist, gives this example. The king died. The queen died. Now, this is a series of events, but not a plot, because the two events are random and unrelated. He says if we add these two words, we now have a perfect plot summary. The king died. The queen died of grief. Can you look back at the definition and see what's been added to that second example? In the first version, two events have happened. There's even a sequence. First the king died, then the queen died. But you're quite right that what is missing is a link between the two. He may have died far away on a battlefield, she on her bed, not even knowing he was gone. But when the two events are causally related, it resonates as a story, and we long to fill in the blanks. Sometimes I ask students a little bit of a trick question. Do stories have to be about human beings? Immediately, many of them shake their heads no, they don't. And they look at me in disbelief when I nod my head, yes, they do, because they remember Bambi and Woody and the Lion King and a computer called Hal. But even when stories are peopled with animals or talking dishes, the truth is we are always reading about human beings. We don't know, though we often surmise, what animals think and feel because they do not tell us. Computers do not fall in love. Candlesticks do not make passes. In the Iliad, as Zeus looks down upon the battlefield, he notes that of all the creatures in the world, none is so pitiable as man. Why? Because so far as we know, only humans reflect upon the future and the past, and humans alone consider their lives with the knowledge of their own mortality. When we're thinking about character, no character is more important to the story than the protagonist. The protagonist is really the answer to the question, whose story is it? And it is crucial to understanding in many times what's going on. Now, you've probably heard the word protagonist before, and you've heard it described or defined as the main character, the hero, the opposite of the antagonist. I'm not going to quibble with those definitions, and I'm not going to say they're wrong, but this is the definition I want you to learn and apply in this class, even if you memorize it. The protagonist is the character in the story with the story's central conflict. Now I'm going to read that one more time. The protagonist is the character in the story with the story's central conflict. Some scholars have also described the protagonist as the character in the story who changes, but I've found it helpful to think of the protagonist as the character offered the opportunity to choose to change or grow. After all, change is hard for human beings. We're not very good at it, and often the very conflicts that rule and shadow our lives are the same ones over and over. We keep returning to old habits of being, doing, and thinking. And of course, conflict implies a choice. Do we always have choices? Look at this example. Imagine a soldier under the command of a corrupt officer who orders him to kill a civilian. If he follows the order, he will, by his own moral code, be guilty of murder. If he does not, he will be court-martialed, perhaps even hanged. Can we say that he has a choice? I would argue that he does. It's an impossible choice, a horrible one, a choice between two bad outcomes. But as those who have risked their lives in support of dangerous causes, he has one. May none of us ever find ourselves with such a stark moral quandary, but this is what great literature often does. It makes us consider, creating what Aristotle called catharsis, the experience of pity and terror, the sense of a shared identity with our fellow human travelers. And of course, characters being human do not always make the best choices or the choices we would approve of. And of course, not all choices are of the life and death variety, even in great literature. Not all characters grow and change. Sometimes a choice is a non-choice. Sometimes a choice is simply a retreat back into what is familiar, even if it is bleak. Another question to think about: are the characters in the story static or dynamic? Are we meant to take the characters as individuals? Sometimes a group of people can behave like a single unit, as with a mob. In To Kill a Mockingbird, the men who show up to lynch Tom Robinson are behaving as a unit. Most are resolved to take him and hang him. But after Scout reminds Mr. Cunningham of his entailment and the legal services that indebt him to Atticus, he's not so certain. First Mr. Cunningham and then the rest look at each other in shame and go home. Both character and plot rely on conflict. Though conflict is typically treated as a part of plot, the protagonist in the story is always conflicted, always pulled two ways. Simply put, if there is no conflict, there is no story. Perhaps this is why we watch so many police procedurals, suspense movies, hospital dramas, and read so many novels like Harry Potter and The Lord of the Rings. Happiness is wonderful, but it doesn't need examination. Story comes from the fracture, when we want two things and can only have one of them. You may have learned in high school that there are different kinds of conflict, and you might have categorized them this way: man versus man, man versus society, man versus nature, man versus himself. One difference between popular fiction and serious literary fiction is that the important conflict is always ultimately interior rather than exterior, within the mind and heart. As William Faulkner famously said, the only thing worth writing about is the human heart in conflict with itself. If we think of a famous example, The Lord of the Rings, Bilbo faces all kinds of conflicts that involve natural and supernatural forces. He has to leave the comfortable society of the Shire and go where hobbits are not thought to belong. He physically fights with other people and with Gollum. Yet he is the protagonist of that story because the central conflict is this: does he give up and go home, or does he continue the journey, no matter what the cost? This is the important takeaway for you. Conflict always has two sides and is within the character. The character wants two things and can only have one, feels two emotions, but these feelings are in tension with each other. When you're asked to name the story's central conflict, then, don't write, "The conflict is Mary's feelings about her parents." Instead, write the conflict is between Mary's desire to become an individual and her desire to please her parents, who refuse to see her as anything but a child. She wants two things, but she can only have one. Conflict should be stated like this then: Mary wants to please her parents, but she wants to find her own way. Often deciding the two sides of the conflict and stating them is difficult. One helpful technique, since literary conflict tends to be about the protagonist's interior conflict, is to think about conflict as a choice between reality and illusion. She has the illusion that someday he will change. The reality is that he never will. Now, to tell the truth, if she's happy about being beaten up or she's happy about their relationship, there's no conflict. Unfortunately, deep down, she is not happy, and so she has to get rid of her illusions in order to make some kind of a choice. Many of the stories I'm using as examples in this slideshow are stories we're going to write about. But I'm going to use a story by James Joyce as an example of how to correctly state conflict. There's not necessarily a right or wrong answer, but there are some that are valid and some that are not. Well, how do we know which is which? We have to make sure our answer matches both the definition of conflict I've given you as well as the details in the story. Often in truly great stories, we're rewarded by multiple readings, seeing more and more meaning in the story each time, but the additional readings do not change, only deepen our experience. Joyce's story Evelyn is set in Dublin and was published around 1914. In the story, Evelyn has promised her mother on the mother's deathbed that she will keep the family together. She has done so and has had a bleak life, working as a clerk in a store where she has few friends, taking her paycheck home to an alcoholic father, and caring for brothers who are unkind. But as the story begins, she's being courted by a sailor who has asked her to go with him and put all that behind her. And at last, the girl considered homely by her brothers has a chance for love and a life of her own. A reader might note that she clearly has two choices and express the conflict this way: remaining with her father versus going with her sailor. What do you think about that answer? Well, sounds pretty good to me. First, I have two sides, right? She can't have both of these. If she stays in Dublin, she can't go with the sailor. If she goes with the sailor, she can't stay in Dublin. I'm good with that. I think that's a pretty good answer. Another, perhaps a bit more perceptive reader, might note that despite her feelings about her father, who is not kind to her, she is a good Catholic girl who has made a promise to her mother and surmised that she wants to keep her promise to her mother, but she wants to be loved and married and to have a life of her own. And perhaps a different reader might express the conflict this way, noting that Evelyn's promise to her mother might be a rationalization, an excuse to keep from going away with her sailor. There might be a truer, deeper conflict. Evelyn wants desperately to leave her bleak life, but she is also terrified to leave behind all that she knows. Now, I'll tell you, I love this answer because it really peels away all of the layers of the story, all of the layers of rationalization of the character. And when the conflict is resolved, her sailor calls and calls to her as she stands motionless at the rail. It is this, her fear, that holds her in place. And how many times do we see this? People who will not step through the door to accept the opportunity because they are afraid. So what is the right answer? Well, instead of thinking of right answer, let's consider which is valid. How would I grade the answer? All are valid because they state conflict as having two sides. The answers are specific and clear. The answers consider all the details of the story after careful reading. And of course, conflict must be resolved in some way. The resolution of the story comes when the writer has shown the reader, sometimes very subtly, that the character has either accepted or rejected the opportunity to change and grow. Another really important element of fiction is the point of view. The best way to describe point of view is to think of it as the eyes through which the writer chooses to tell the story and the voice through which the story is narrated. The point of view also establishes narrative distance, a way of thinking about how close the narrator is to the events of the story. An old man thinking back on his childhood, or a child in the midst of her joy or her terror. We will know this through the observation the character makes or the language that she uses. Here it is important to make a distinction between the writer, the person sitting at the desk and creating the story with the tools of words and sentences, and the narrator, the teller of the tale, the mask or persona adopted for purposes of the story. In the photos below, you can see what I'm talking about. At your far left is the photo of a cover drawn by Barry Moser, a very famous artist, of a collection of short stories by Flannery O'Connor, or maybe it's a book of criticism, I can't remember. But the character is Parker, of O'Connor's short story Parker's Bag. And he has this tattoo of God. Now, he doesn't look at all, of course, like the young woman in the two pictures in the center. O'Connor with her necklace and her pretty hair, and then in the photo right beside it, where she stands with a self-portrait, a painting she made of herself with a peacock. And O'Connor also drew the cartoon at the far right using linoleum blocks for a yearbook that she edited when she was in college. Now, narrator and character are not the same, but narrator and writer are not the same. Types of point of view will often include first-person narrative, in which the narrator is a character, sometimes major, sometimes minor, sometimes reliable, and sometimes not, who tells the story using I, or the first-person pronoun. And of course, not all people are self-aware or honest. In A Rose for Emily, a story set in Mississippi about a reclusive woman who gets away with murder, William Faulkner uses we as though the unnamed narrator is speaking for the whole town of Jefferson, and of course we is the plural first-person pronoun. When Miss Emily Grierson died, he begins the story, our whole town went to her funeral. Therefore, when we analyze and write about a story, we should refer to the tellers of the tale as narrators. The writer writes, but the narrator is the one who tells. Mark Twain writes The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn in the voice of Huck himself, and while Huck is quite naive about the evils of slavery, he thinks he's being immoral for helping Jim escape, as if he is stealing from Jim's owner, and decides he has no use for civilization and its morality. Twain, the writer, knows exactly who is right and who is wrong. Twain is the writer, but Huck is the narrator. Although some stories may follow very closely an actual event in the writer's life, many more do not. We will focus on the story as the thing itself before we think about the role of the writer's life and what influence it may have had in the creation of the fiction. After all, fiction implies that we will not necessarily find a one-to-one correspondence between facts in a life and facts in a story as we might expect in a memoir or an autobiography. The truth of the story must come from the impression of life it conveys, the truth of human nature. Now, if you look to the left, Herman Melville wrote brilliantly about the sea, and he went to sea. Um, and he begins in first person Moby Dick or the whale with "Call me Ishmael. Some years ago, never mind how long precisely, having little or no money in my purse and nothing in particular to interest me on shore, I thought I would sail about a little and see the watery part of the world." Third person narration uses third person pronouns. The writer has adopted a persona that is a little more distant from the story than if the narrator related his or her own tale. The word omniscient is made from the prefix omni or all and the suffix science or knowing. Therefore, an omniscient narrator is an all-knowing narrator. Sometimes this is limited to one character. The narrator relates the thoughts and feelings of one character, but not others. On the next slide is a paragraph from one of the stories we will read, Joyce Carol Oates' "Where Are You Going? Where Have You Been?" and one that you may choose to use for your first essay. In this story, Oates has used third-person limited omniscience to tell the story of Connie, a young girl who wishes she were older and ends up discovering that growing up means learning about the existence of evil. Connie sat with her eyes closed in the sun, dreaming and dazed with the warmth about her, as if this were a kind of love, the caresses of love, and her mind slipped over onto thoughts of the boy she had been with the night before, and how nice he had been, how sweet it always was, not the way someone like June would suppose, but sweet, gentle, the way it was in movies and promised in songs. And when she opened her eyes, she hardly knew where she was. The backyard ran off into the weeds and a fence-like line of trees. Notice that Oates' narrator relates the physical details of the setting, tells us what Connie is doing. But the narrator goes much further. We not only know what Connie is doing, we know what she is thinking and dreaming, including her thought that her sister June would not have understood what happened between Connie and the boy she spent time with the night before. However, Connie is the only character with whom the narrator takes such liberty. In this story, even though we realize that the writer knows that Connie's innocence will prove to be her undoing, we see the world entirely through the lens of Connie's mind. Later, when a mysterious man appears at her house, we can only know him through Connie's impression and his behavior and his appearance. We cannot know for certain the meaning behind his secret code, for example, or how he knows about her and her family, unless he tells her. We have to draw our own conclusions from the evidence at hand. The choice of point of view, then, will determine much of what the reader will know directly and how much must be inferred. To break point of view, to suddenly decide, for instance, to switch or go inside the mind of another character, is to cheat, and readers who are perceptive will see it as such. Sometimes a writer chooses to make a third-person narrator objective, as though the narrator is an impersonal lens, a camera, or a fly on the wall, which reports what the reader should see and hear, but not the private thoughts of any characters. In the instance of an objective narrator, the reader must draw conclusions about the character's attitudes, beliefs, and thoughts entirely from what the characters say and do. Shirley Jackson's powerful and famous short story, The Lottery, is an example of an objective point of view. A group of New England villagers gather on June 27th at 10 o'clock to engage in an old ritual. Tessie Hutchinson, who arrives late, comes rushing in, flustered, saying she clean forgot what day it was, but when she realized her family had gone on, she had come a-running. This is the excuse she makes. Should the reader believe her? How do we decide? A totally omniscient narrator is the creator of the world of the story, truly God with a lower G. This narrator may allow the writer to focus on one character's thoughts and yet inform the reader of information and events that the character herself may not even know about. In Faulkner's Barn Burning, the story is so exclusively the 10-year-old boy Sardi's that we might be tempted to think that the narrator is limited to his consciousness, except that the narrator gives us details about Sardi's father, Abner, that the boy simply does not know. The choice of narrator is a choice that often, maybe always, controls what the writer can and cannot include in the story. If we have a first-person narrator, the narrator can only reveal what she knows from her own experience. If we have third-person, limited omniscience, we have similar constraints. As we read stories this semester, we will examine how this affects the stories as we have them and what writers gain and lose by these choices.